Hello! In this video, we will be discussing the Structured Literacy with E.A.S.E Program Pacing Guide for grades K-2. Before we jump into the pacing guide, we'll take a moment to explain the sequences of this program. There are two sequences that students must go through before they can begin the reading sequences, and those are the sound sequence and the readiness sequence. The sound sequence focuses on learning the basic sounds of alphabet letters, which include basic consonant sounds and short vowel sounds. The readiness sequence includes learning the 109 most critical high frequency words that students need before they can enter the reading sequences. Sequences 1 through 4 include the reading sequences, where students are given a decodable book with most of their lessons that goes along with the skill and also includes those 109 words they learned in the readiness sequence. The supplemental sequence is not part of the printed program, but it is a downloadable supplemental sequence where you can find the lesser common skills that if your core program teaches them, or you need a way to pull in an extra day of mapping and reinforcement for those skills, you can find those in the supplemental sequence. So the very first sequence, skip ahead here, the sound sequence, this is going to go over, again, the basic alphabet sounds, and these are 2-day lessons. It takes 2 days of exercise with the actual sound. That includes multisensory exercises. It includes doing a beginning, middle, or end activity so they can identify where the sounds are in words. They also learn to write the letters that represent the sounds, and then they become more fluent on their recognition of sounds through the use of a building sound deck. The readiness sequence includes activities that can be taught in 1 or 2 days. It really kind of depends on the sort of timeline you're working with, but each word is the focus for the lesson and comes along with an activity sheet that helps students get to know the letters and these really important high frequency words, how to spell them, how to read them, how to find them in context of other words. And students use this sequence to become solid on those 109 words. The reading sequences include sequences 1 through 4, and you will see really 4 different lesson plan types in these sequences. We have the isolated sounds lessons that focus on specific sounds and the graphemes that represent them. There are spelling rules lessons that focus on really spelling rules in the English language that we can teach students explicitly to help them with their encoding and decoding. There are affixes lessons that focus on some of the most common prefixes and suffixes students will encounter in the English language, and they will learn the meaning of those affixes and how they change the meaning of a base word when added or taken away. And then there are division types and division rules lessons that teach our syllable types and division rules lessons that teach all the different syllable types. There are 7 that are taught in this program. And then they're going to learn the division rules too. So where we break up those words, multisyllabic words, to represent the syllable types that we've learned. So one important thing to know about the types of lessons is that they have a different number of, there's a different number of days for each lesson type. In the isolated sounds, spelling rules, affixes, and syllable division rules lessons, there are 4 days of lesson plans. And then the syllable type lessons plans, those are just 1 day. They're 1 quick day to introduce a syllable type before going into more detail in the following lessons on that syllable type. And then there are 2-day lesson plans. These are the syllable sort lessons, where students are taking their building knowledge of syllable types and learning to identify really which syllable type is represented in a word. So something important to know is that this program does consist of, 1 day, 2-day, and 4-day lesson plans, as you can see in front of you. And one of the strengths of this program is how this allows for flexibility. For example, this program is meant to be taught using small group instruction, so teachers should use the program placement assessments to determine the best place to begin students in the program and then progress them from there. But they are written with flexibility, and we do keep getting the question, what would the pacing of this program look like for the typically progressing student? So this pacing guide laid out before you is not to say that this is where all of your students should be. This is to say it's where you might find your typically progressing student. And when you teach this program, we do recommend that you teach the 1-day lesson plans in their entirety. And even when you can, to teach the 2-day lesson plans in their entirety. But there's a lot of flexibility here in the 4-day lesson plans. So the 4-day lesson plans, you might choose to cut them down to the one single day, day one, for skills that either they're covered really well in your core program or even in your grammar program or spelling program. Or maybe there's skills you don't find students having trouble picking up quickly. You might only teach day one. Day one introduces the skill. Day one gives kids a chance to map it and a chance to write with it so they get some encoding. And so some of them just need this quick hit before they can move on. And I will say day one does not include the book. So either you would give the day one lesson plan to students who are moving very quickly and picking up on it, and you either could give them the book at the end of the day to read for fun, or don't, because there's other reading exercises in day one where they can practice the skill. Then day two adds in a layer of more mapping practice, but now students are given the book to read. Then we go into day three. Day three really is just an extra day of reinforced mapping and sound practice. It, of course, still has high frequency word exercises and phonological awareness exercises, but day three is really best reserved for students who are still struggling to master this concept. So most typically progressing students are not going to need day three. Day three would be the first we would recommend omitting when you have students moving through the program more quickly and not needing the full 4 days. Day four is a lesson plan that includes vocabulary and reading comprehension skill and strategy practice. There's also a quick check on day four to check in on how kids are encoding these words. So day four is going to be important because it really helps us round out, everything on that Scarborough's reading rope. So you will want to include day four if you're going to fully develop the lesson. So the big takeaway here is the 4-day lessons are where you have your most flexibility to differentiate. You may, for the quickest movement through the program, you might choose to only bring in day one that allows you to explicitly introduce and work with the skill and then move on, with or without the book at the end. Then you might need all 4 days for students who are really struggling with this skill. Now, this pacing guide is going to take you through the typically progressing student, and we're being a little conservative with our recommendations. So we are recommending in this pacing guide that you take students through day 1, 2, and 4. But remember, if you need to move more quickly through the program or your students do not need all 4 of those days, you can drop day 2 as well and just give students the book at the end of day 1 and then progress on to day 4 with the reading comprehension skill and strategy and vocabulary practice. But again, for the sake of this pacing guide, you'll notice that we have built in day 1, day 2, and day 4 to give to the typically progressing student and show where it will put them throughout the course of the program. So you'll notice that kindergarten begins, this is color-coded along with the sequences. So the sound sequence is represented here in this sort of orange-yellow color. And we would take kindergartners through the entire sound sequence in its entirety. So we would teach both lessons for every skill. And the other thing we would recommend doing, and we've seen teachers approach this in a number of ways, but we really like this idea of, we know kids have to master the 109 words in the readiness sequence, and that's a lot of words for kids to master. So we've shown how you might build in some of those 109 within the sound sequence. So you're already starting to teach some of those words, but you have to wait until kids have the sound knowledge to map those words, because in the readiness sequence, kids do map words. So for example, lesson 7, day 1 here, kids have already been introduced to A, S, and T. So you can introduce the word A, the word as, and the word at. And I've put asterisks here to show that when students map these words, they'll recognize right away, this does not make the short A sound. So we are going to learn another sound that A makes. And then as, what do you notice that is unique about the word as? S does not make the typical sound for S. So we're going to learn another sound that S makes. You don't have to go into the spelling rules on these kind of exceptions at this point. You're just getting kids to learn the words, map them, and to start recognizing that our words have nuances. They have differences in how they can be pronounced. So similarly, when we get to lesson 8, day 1, They could map the words I, if, is, it, its, and you would recognize on these two words that the letters are making different sounds than what they've learned so far. And similarly down here, lesson 11, day 1, students would recognize that in find, I is not making the I sound they have learned so far. So they would carry on this way through the sound sequence until they get to the end, and then they would have several weeks here where they really dive into the readiness sequence. And that's what you're seeing here in orange. Now, I've broken up the 109 words in the readiness sequence by skills. Here's why. We do not expect kindergartners to learn what digraphs are or memorize how to use them, nor schwa especially, or VCE syllables, or open vowels and CLEs and so on. We don't expect that. But kids do have to learn these 109 words to dive into the reading sequence and be able to read those stories. And so why not group them together in a way that helps create a construct around the words they're learning, or some kind of pattern or recognizable similarity among the words. And in the meantime, you can be introducing the names for some of these because we're going to hit digraphs by the end of kindergarten. So in this week, you could say, what do you recognize about these words that we're learning and mapping? Oh, you do notice that 2 of the letters together make one sound. And that might be as far as you go with your explanation that week. But they're going to learn these words that week and then move on to the next week. When you get to schwa week, you won't necessarily teach what schwa means or the definition of the word or how it appears in the unstressed syllable of the accent. You might not get into that level of detail with schwa, but you might have them map and say, what is unique about these words? They all make the sound, but they make the sound using different vowels. Then you focus on this idea of the long vowel sound that's made with a magic E at the end. Those are all the words they'll learn that week, and then so on. And notice it says focus on because not all of these are perfect. We get down to, for example, focus on VR, our controlled vowels. At first, you've got some of the more straightforward ones that make the OR sound or the sound, but then we get down and we have more sound, but then we go into these ERE, ARE, EIR, these letter combinations that are still controlled by that R. And then we go into a week where we talk about 2 sounds Y can make at the end of a word. Sometimes it makes the I sound, sometimes it makes the E sound. And then so on. And you're going to make it all the way to your ow sounds, your oo sounds, and your sounds. All the while, students are learning these 109 words in a meaningful way because they're grouped together to make the learning a little bit easier. Now, that's several weeks of learning that because it is so important, but we also realize that this is a great opportunity to go back and hit on the sounds from the sound sequence that were maybe some kids were struggling with. You might pull small groups, pull them over, have them go back and hit on some of those harder to grasp sounds. Just continue sound practice during this time. You could be building your high frequency word deck. Of course, in the readiness sequence, they're introduced to 109 words. So every time you introduce a new word in the 109, add that to your high frequency word deck, and every day review through that deck with students as a fluency exercise. Again, they're mapping these words in this sequence. So lumping them together by similar spelling patterns is going to really help them learn those 109 more quickly and to map them more easily. So when they're done with the readiness sequence, students will move into sequence 1. This is by about week 22. Again, this is your typically progressing student. So everything up to this point has been taught in its entirety. Starting here in sequence 1, you'll notice we eliminate day 3 from the lesson plans. This is how your typically progressing student will likely move through the program. So in sequence 1, you'll see the progression here where they do lesson 1, day 1, lesson 1, day 2, and then that's because lesson 1 is a 1-day lesson. So they wrap that up, and then they move to lesson 2, day 1, lesson 2, day 2, and then lesson 2, day 4. And we include day 4 because that's where our reading comprehension piece is, and a quick check for you to check their encoding abilities. So sequence 1 is going to take kindergartners through the CVC syllable type, and it's going to take them also through a review of some of the trickier consonants to master. There's a couple of lessons focused here on B and D, where there is a deck that helps students differentiate between B, D, P, and Q, and so you're going to get some more practice with that. And there are a couple of spelling rules introduced in Sequence 1 as well. All the while, students are starting to read books that build and spiral, so the skills continue to be revisited. By about week 30, kindergartners are going to move into Sequence 2. Again, this is Sequence 2 in its entirety with the exception of Day 3. It has been omitted because the typically progressing student won't need Day 3 for practice. Now you can save Day 3 for those students who do need the extra help with it. This is going to introduce us to some spelling rules, but also it's going to give these kindergartners their first exposure at digraphs as well as blends. And that will take us through the end of the kindergarten year. Something you'll notice about first grade, when we begin first grade, you will notice that the colors on the pacing guide are kind of whited out a little bit, and that is because you're going to start first grade with a review of the CVC syllable type, a review of digraphs, and a review of blends. So the white color just means these are lessons that were introduced in a grade prior, or in a sequence prior, or grade prior. And so you will pull those lessons from the previous sequence. And then when they're done with that review, they're ready to move on to the new lessons, which in this case start on lesson 12, day 1 with trigraphs. So then first graders will move through the rest of sequence 2, which includes glued sounds, again, trigraphs. They're going to start learning about compound words and schwa and the VCE syllable type. They'll even start learning about how to a syllable sort, so how to identify words that have certain syllable types represented and how they're different from other words. And they'll wrap that up in first grade. Then they're going to move into sequence 3, and they're going to complete the entire sequence 3 in first grade. And again, they'll teach it in its entirety with the exception of day 3. Those have been pulled out for the typically progressing student. So in sequence 3, students are going to learn about regular vowel teams. They're going to learn more trigraphs. They're going to learn R-controlled vowels. And they're going to get down to more advanced schwa review, more affixes. They're going to round out their study of all of those very important skills. And that will take us through week 35 of the school year. And then second grade. Again, second grade begins with a review of previously taught lessons. Those are whited out here. They'll review CVC syllable type, VCE syllable type. Really, it's any syllable type that has been previously taught. They'll review the vowel teams, syllables type, and R-controlled vowels before they move on to the new lessons. So the new lessons will take them through the entire sequence 4. Sequence 4 is going to go in and teach us some more of those higher level skills, the different ways we can represent Y. They're going to learn open vowels in those multisyllabic words. They are going to learn diphthongs, and they're going to continue to learn important spelling rules. And they will round out their second grade year, again, the typically progressing student, by moving through every lesson, just cutting out that day 3 of the 4-day lesson, and this will take them through week 35 of the school year. So that is it. That's how you might see a typically progressing student move through the program in their small group. But remember, if you need to move through the program more quickly because maybe your core program teaches a skill that we have in sequence 4, they teach it in first grade, or you just have students who don't need all this time on the skills, that is where you can start cutting down to just day 1 with a book and day 4. Or maybe just day 1 for a quick introduction. We hear of teachers who do that a lot with the affix lessons. They often find that, some of their learners have already learned these affixes, maybe through their core program. And so they just spend one day mapping and making sure they're really solid on it before they move on, because now that affix will show up in the books they read in this program. So they definitely want to hit on it, but they may not need 4 or even 3 or even 2 days for that skill. So if you have to progress through quicker, that is an option for you. Just remember, your ability to differentiate really lies in taking those 4-day lessons and taking from them what you need and going from there with your learners. That is all. Thank you so much.